Okay, Thomas Freed here. I've spoken before about how the power to use graduated tax brackets goes back to a series of Supreme Court decisions in the late 1870s and 80s, where the Supreme Court ruled that the power to use graduated tax brackets was based on the power of Congress to discriminate against the inanimate commodities and articles of commerce subject to taxation, as well as the power to discriminate against the corporate person who didn't have a whole set of rights and who, as a corporation, was subject to excise taxation on all of their earnings through the taxation by excise of the privilege of incorporation. So they were allowed to use graduated tax brackets to tax corporations, which were the only parties subject to income taxes previous to the 16th Amendment. Income tax had, of course, been a legitimate part of the taxing powers as part of the indirect taxation by impost, duty, and excise, where income wasn't the object of the tax or the subject of taxation. It was the yardstick that measured the amount of tax, where income was the mechanism by which the amount of tax owed on the revenues derived from the federally taxable activity, subject to some impost, duty, or excise. Income is the yardstick that measures the amount of tax owed on the taxable earnings. But it's based on the power of Congress to discriminate against commodities, articles of commerce, corporations, and foreign persons who are also privileged by the government in being allowed here to work. But I ask you, what power does Congress have to discriminate against an American citizen or any group of American citizens or the American citizens as a whole? Can they write different law for blacks and whites, or Christians and Jews and Muslims, or Catholics or Protestants, or the young or the old, or the male or the female, or the gay or the straight? Can they discriminate against the American people on any of these bases? No, of course not. That'd be patently unconstitutional. It violates the equal rights, equal opportunity, equal protection, and equal civil rights clauses of the Constitution. So of course they can't write discriminating law for any of those groups. So on what basis would they choose private property, wealth, or earnings to be allowed to discriminate against the American people rather than commodities, articles of commerce, and corporations? There is none. There is no basis. The use of graduated taxation being enforced upon American citizens is patently unconstitutional because it's not uniform and it's not apportioned. It's a tax now, as it's enforced, without constitutional limitation. And that's unconstitutional. That was not the effect the 16th Amendment had. It is patently unconstitutional to impose graduated taxes on the American people and put them into different tax brackets that create classes that are then set at warfare with one another in a system of class warfare rather than one of unified representation. So the brackets and the graduated taxation, you know where that comes from? That's the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which reads a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. That's where you find graduated taxation rather than uniform taxation, and that's where you find the taxation of income as well. The earnings of the people rather than just those of the privileged corporations or foreign persons, or those licensed to sell commodities, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, petroleum fuels, and others. So graduated taxation and the income tax today are neither uniform nor apportioned. It's enforced as a tax without limitation, and that is patently unconstitutional. Now, is there any evidence of this? Well, yes, there is. Why don't we go look at what the Supreme Court said in 1896 in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company. This is an income tax law that tried to tax rents and other sources of earnings and income. And the Supreme Court looked at it, and this is what they had to say. They declared the tax on rents to be a direct tax on property, and since it wasn't apportioned to the states for payment, it wasn't sustainable under the Constitution as a direct tax. So they struck down the legislation. But let's read what one of the justices had to say in addition to the court's majority opinion striking down the legislation. So, why graduated tax brackets are unconstitutional. Basically, they're not uniform, and that's the end of the discussion. But here we go. Biden's announced plan to exempt all persons earning under $200,000 from any increase in income tax, while promising to pass an ever-increasing burden to those who earn more than that number of 200,000, is patently unconstitutional and was recognized as such over 100 years ago by the Supreme Court in this Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company decision. Furthermore, his promise is a lie, because he's now promising also to let the Trump tax cuts expire next year. That will raise the income tax rates on all persons, everybody, including those making less than $200,000. Donald Trump lowered the rates for every single bracket and reduced the number of brackets, and reduced the threshold levels for entering the new bracket so that you get taxed at a lower rate for lower amounts. And so Joe Biden is lying to you again. The nation was warned by the Supreme Court over 100 years ago in 1896 that this, what is now occurring in our society and in our presidential election, is exactly what would happen if our politicians were ever allowed to enact, or promised to enact, discriminating rates through tax brackets created by taxing legislation under the promise of relief or promise of punishment to any particular group or class of persons in society based on their level of earning. Now, this program of Joe Biden's to not tax anyone less than 200,000 alleged, which he's already violating, isn't really Joe Biden's, of course. He's never had an original idea in his entire life. He's done nothing but plagiarize everything he's written and steal other people's programs' ideas. This, of course, was Barack Obama's program idea, to not tax anyone less than $250,000. This was Barack's plan to divide America and to relieve the poor buying their votes and punish the wealthy to take their money to pass it out to the poor to buy their votes. But why should you listen to me? What do I know? I'm just an American who's still radical enough to actually believe in and defend the Constitution. Actually, here I'm just reading the opinion of Supreme Court Justice Fields in his supporting opinion of the court that he felt compelled to add to the majority opinion in the Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company decision. He wanted it on the record, obviously believing that the majority opinion did not adequately address the seriousness of the philosophical problem and issues and differences with the Constitution raised by the provisions of the legislation that the court was rejecting. He thought it needed to be stronger. So perhaps if I just let his opinion do the talking. This is from Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust, 157 U.S. 429, 1895, page 599, and others. I'll read the page number as we go through it. I'm not going to repeat the site for the case over and over. The inherent and fundamental nature and character of a tax is that of a contribution to the support of the government, levied upon the principle of equal and uniform apportionment among the persons taxed, and any other exaction does not come within the legal definition of a tax. Page 599. Hamilton says in one of his papers, The Continentalist, the genius of liberty reprobates everything arbitrary and discretionary in taxation. It exacts that every man, by a definite and general rule, should know what proportion of his property the state demands. On page 596. This, of course, derived from the recognition of the constitutional requirements that all direct taxes be apportioned by population to the states for collection. That's under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. And that all indirect taxes be uniform in operation. That's under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Thus ensuring that every tax touches and operates on every man equally and never disproportionately on any one person or group or class. Justice Fields goes on in discussing the problem with legislatively mandated tax brackets providing preferential treatment in taxing legislation to certain classes. He states, the income tax law under consideration is marked by discriminating features which affect the whole law. It discriminates between those who receive an income of $4,000 and those who do not. It thus vitiates, in my judgment, by this arbitrary discrimination, the whole legislation. So you can see here, Justice Fields is saying that because it creates even just two classes, one above 4,000 and one below, that cannot be tolerated under the Constitution. No class legislation is allowed. Not even two brackets. Justice Field, of course, immediately recognizes the true nature of all such legislation. He goes on. The legislation and the discrimination it makes is class legislation. Whenever a distinction is made in the burdens a law imposes or in the benefits it confers on any citizens by reason of their birth or wealth or religion, it is class legislation and leads inevitably to oppression and abuses and to general unrest and disturbance in society. It's page 596. Did he see it coming or what? This man is a prophet talking to you about what's been happening in America for the last 25 years. He continues in his opinion. It was hoped and believed that the great amendments to the Constitution which followed the late Civil War had rendered such legislation impossible for all future time. But the objectionable legislation reappears in the act under consideration. Page 596 again. The great amendments to which Justice Fields refers are, of course, the 13th Amendment barring slavery and involuntary servitude, the 14th Amendment providing for the civil rights and containing the about to be obliterated Equal Protection Clause guaranteeing to all persons the equal protection of the law, and the 15th Amendment securing voting rights for all persons, enacted after the Civil War and intended to terminate the discriminatory practices of the day aimed at Black persons in the southern states. In recognition of the fact that taxing policy should not and legitimately cannot violate the equal rights of the individual citizens secured by the Constitution and its amendments, Justice Fields writes, there is no such thing in the theory of our national government as unlimited power of taxation in Congress. There are limitations, as he justly observes, of its powers arising out of the essential nature of all free governments. There are reservations of individual rights without which society could not exist, and which are respected by every government. The right of taxation is subject to these limitations. He cites here Citizens Savings Loan Association v. Topeka and Parkersburg v. Brown. And again, this is Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust, page 599 from 1895. The concern identified by Justice Fields here is simple and obvious. All class legislation, taxing or otherwise, violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, requiring that all persons be given equal protection and treatment under the law. His concerns and warnings were truly prophetic, as we are certainly now confronted today with all of the same aspects of the discriminatory class legislation income tax that he confronted and warned us about, and that the court rejected in his day, 1896. In conclusion, Justice Fields lays out the philosophical conflict just beginning in his day, but now beginning to consume America as it comes to fulfillment through the Democrats, Obama's and Biden's tax plan to exempt all persons earning less than now $200,000 and to punish everyone making more with higher rates. Of course, that turns out to be a lie too, because when the Trump tax cuts expire, the unlimited SALT deduction will come back, which benefits the wealthy in the liberal states like New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, California, Illinois, where the property values are very, very high. They pay very high state taxes and deduct that from their earnings on the federal tax, thus keeping all the tax dollars in the state and paying fewer tax dollars to the Fed, shirking their share of the federal tax burden and passing it to the more rural, poorer states that don't have billion-dollar properties in their cities and $20,000 rents for their people. So the rural conservative states have to ultimately pay a larger tax burden than the wealthy states of California, New York, and the others because of this unlimited SALT deduction, which lets the wealthy deduct tens of thousands of dollars that are kept in the state. And of course, Trump capped that at $10,000 across the board for everyone to make it more fair. Well, that's going to expire too, but Justice Fields continues. Here, I close my opinion. I could not say less in view of questions of such gravity that go down to the very foundations of the government. If the provisions of the Constitution can be set aside by an act of Congress, where is the course of usurpation to end? The present assault upon capital is but the beginning. It will be but the stepping stone to others, larger and more sweeping, till our political contests will become a war of the poor against the rich, a war constantly growing in intensity and bitterness. If the court sanctions the power of discriminating taxation and nullifies the uniformity mandate of the Constitution, as said by one who has been all his life a student of our institutions, it will mark the hour when the sure decadence of our present government will commence. If the purely arbitrary limitation of $4,000 in the present law can be sustained, none having less than that amount of income being assessed or taxed for the support of the government, the limitation of future Congresses may be fixed at a much larger sum, at $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 or $200,000 maybe, parties possessing an income of that amount alone being bound to bear the burdens of government. Or the limitation may be designated at such an amount as a board of walking delegates may deem necessary. There is no safety in allowing the limitation to be adjusted except in strict compliance with the mandates of the Constitution, which require its taxation, if imposed by direct taxes, to be apportioned among the states according to the representation, and if imposed by indirect taxes, to be uniform in operation. And so far as practicable, in proportion to their property, equal upon all citizens. Unless the rule of the Constitution governs, a majority may fix the limitation at such rate as will not include any of their own number. And that's exactly what Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and the Democrats are promising to do. That's exactly. And here it is. You were warned about it 30 years ago, 128 years ago. The Supreme Court said, here's what's going to happen if you use graduated income tax. And here we are. Class warfare, the rich against the poor. Poor don't pay, the burden falls on the wealthy, and the Democrats buy the votes by passing out money stolen from the hardworking men and women of America. It occurs to me that since the 14th Amendment was put in place in 1868 to establish, preserve, and protect the rights of Black persons in America, isn't it truly ironic that it was a Black man, Barack Obama, who used the destruction of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to rise to capture the office of the President of the United States through the promise of the enactment of this exact same type of discriminatory taxation, constituting the prohibited class legislation exactly as envisioned by Justice Fields in his opinion, with exactly the same type of discriminatory class legislation and taxation that was rejected as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1896 in this Pollock decision. Now, many people, specifically attorneys, judges, Department of Justice officials, IRS employees, liberals, Democrats, stupid politicians, will try to tell you that the 16th Amendment did away with all of these problems with a bracketed discriminatory income tax, and that it effectively repealed the Pollock decision as the controlling decision in the matter. They want you to believe that the 16th Amendment overrules and does away with these issues of such gravity identified in the Pollock decision. However, while the Supreme Court did rule in the Bruce-Shaber decision that the income tax legislation that was enacted in 1913 under the 16th Amendment was constitutional and upheld that legislation, in truth, the ruling did not and does not touch the Pollock decision to modify or set aside the court's holdings in that matter. You see, in Pollock, the court strikes down a legislative attempt to tax directly and without the limitations of apportionment and proportionate imposition, upholding the Article 1 constitutional prohibition on disproportionate, non-apportioned direct taxation of we the people, our property, and the fruits of our labors derived from the simple exercise of the right to work. In the Bruce-Shaber and Stanton decisions of 1916 addressing the income tax after the 16th Amendment, the court upholds the tax as a constitutional exercise of the power to tax indirectly by impost, duty, and excise, where income is the yardstick, not the object of the tax or the subject of taxation. It did not rule that under the 16th Amendment, the government now has the power to tax income directly and without any limitations, as the IRS and DOJ and lower federal judiciary would have you falsely believe now that they're enforcing nothing but judicial legislation. Judicial legislation with respect to the alteration to the Constitution they've made by interpretively adding the word direct to the 16th Amendment to enforce the tax as a direct tax without limitation, in violation of the Supreme Court, in violation of the Constitution, in violation of the written law, in violation of the 14th Amendment, in violation of the 13th Amendment. Everything they're doing now is based on this false belief and false rulings that never came from the Supreme Court. They all came out of the lower circuit courts, like the Ninth Circuit which are trying to put in place socialism. Everybody knows that. The Ninth Circuit's rulings get overturned all the time because they're constantly pushing liberal socialism. And that's where this direct application of the income tax comes from. Circuit court decisions that are in rebellion against the Supreme Court, in rebellion against the Constitution, in rebellion against the requirement that all taxing powers be limited in some form, in rebellion against representative government, as this power to steal without limitation becomes the power to rule absolutely. Though it did not rule that under the 16th Amendment, the government now has the power to tax income directly and without any limitation. The two cases, Pollock and Brushaber, address entirely different constitutional powers. One addressing direct taxation in 1896, the other addressing indirect taxation in 1915. One striking down as unconstitutional a tax laid directly but without apportionment of the tax or a proportionate imposition of it, in violation of the requirement that all direct taxes be apportioned. The other, in 1916, upholds the power of the federal government to tax indirectly, while measuring the amount of tax owed by the income or profit derived from the impost, duty, or excise taxable activity. Two decisions have no impact whatsoever on each other, and one certainly does not render the other irrelevant or replace. They each address a different taxing power of the Constitution, each constrained by a different limitation, and each ruling is strictly within that power addressed in the case. Direct taxation in 1896 in Pollock, indirect taxation in 1916 in Brushaber, and Stanton v. Baltic Mining, the two cases the Supreme Court settled consecutively in 1950, one taking Brushaber dealing with the collection of the tax at the source by withholding, declaring it constitutional because of this withholding. Collection of the source, the shifting of the burden, it's indirect. The second case, Stanton v. Baltic Mining, addressed the power to tax corporate mining and the power of the corporations to deduct what they took out of the mine as appreciation of the value, so there'd be no tax on it. And in both cases, the tax was upheld as being indirect. And in Stanton v. Baltic Mining, it's quite clear, the court rules, 16th Amendment creates no new powers of taxation. It simply prohibits the complete and plenary power of income taxation, which exists from the beginning, from being taken out of the category of indirect taxation to which it inherently belonged. Income had been used to measure impost, duty, or excise taxes on foreigners, imports, exports, in foreign places, on commodities, on licenses, and on corporations since 1788 and the adoption of the Constitution. So all of the issues and problems with the discriminatory, bracketed, class legislation-based income tax system that were identified by Supreme Court Justice Fields, where the tax imposes different rates of tax on the income of different groups or classes of citizens in America, effectively establishing distinct classes of citizens who are not treated equally under the law, but are thus denied equal protection, equal access, equal opportunity, and equal rights to enjoy the fruits of their labor. It is still entirely improper and unconstitutional. And if you recognize the current existing IRS enforcement operation as being unconstitutional for exactly these same identified but never discussed reasons concerning the resultant affected socialist class society we have today, congratulations, you get an A. So the Democrats are working to completely destroy the constitutional republic by exacerbating the system of class warfare that arises out of the federal income tax, because it is literally the tax brackets of Section 1, tax imposed, that define the classes in society that have been kept at war with one another. And this class warfare system prevents the politicians from representing the whole of the American people. They are compelled to pick one class or the other to represent and exacerbate the class warfare by never trying to write law for everyone, but only trying to write law that protects their class or punishes the class they don't represent. And the more class warfare that results in the streets, the more the people call out to the government to step in and squelch the violence, chaos, anarchy, and class warfare that they engineered in order to ascend to an ever greater seat of authority and power. Until ultimately, government rules you, but doesn't represent. And shortly after that, the nation falls into bankruptcy, chaos, anarchy, and of course, revolution. And that's what the Democrats are working for through the class warfare system of the income tax. Republicans haven't done much to oppose it, have they? They've both gone along with the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, and the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto, the Federal Reserve Bank, a quasi-corporate government monopoly on currency and credit. They've also kind of gone along with the 10th plank, public education, run by the central government, which becomes, of course, not education, indoctrinating propaganda, which is what's happened in our colleges and schools for the last 25 years, which is why the far left radical student youth are now yelling for the Nazis to be put back in power. They're supporting the people that want to eliminate Israel and the Jews. This is how bad and corrupt it has become. It has led the youth to Nazi Germany.